Welcome back to the Empower Podcast. My name is Blaine, and today we are joined by Peter Van Garderen, co-founder of Landano, a Cardano project which seeks to allow owners to manage land records for their real estate property via an easy-to-use dApp. So thanks, Peter, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
No worries at all. Excited for this conversation. There's a bit of overlap between our projects with respect to kind of property and also focusing in on Africa as well. So keen to learn more about Landano and also your future plans. But to start us off, can you maybe do a quick introduction, tell the podcast a bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Who I am, I'm a professional archivist. I went to grad school to get a master's degree in archival science at the University of British Columbia here in Vancouver, Canada, where I live with my family, my wife and kids. So for the past 20 years, I've been working as essentially an IT consultant, a IT specialist, focusing on digital archives, electronic record keeping systems, and the preservation, long-term accessibility of digital archive collections. Archivists, that's what we've been doing for centuries. So we're essentially librarians that manage collections of historical documents that you might want to keep for historical reasons, for reference reasons, for legal reasons, to prove certain rights and claims, just for business purposes, to keep track of how much wheat you got in the warehouse, that kind of thing. So we started keeping records as a society pretty early on. At the beginning, as soon as we started figuring out how to write, and then we start to have people that need to kind of keep track of those records, and that those are archivists. So in the medieval times, we developed some more professional practices, actually around proving the authenticity of land claim documents. So some duke says, I own this piece of land over here, and here's my document and seal to prove it. Then somebody had to go study that to prove it was actually authentic or not. And a lot of our practice and discipline in archival science comes from those early days of document analysis. And we still, to this day, apply those practices to evaluate whether electronic records are authentic or not. There's a number of practices and tools that we use from that methodology. So yeah, that's our world. I myself am kind of a pioneer in taking those practices and standards and then implementing them in free and open source software tools. So I developed a product called Archivematica, which is like a backend digital preservation system for institutions mostly in the library, archives, museums, gallery space, but also a lot of public sector governments use it, NGOs and so forth, intergovernmental organizations. And then another one called Access to Memory, which is kind of like, you can think of like a WordPress or a Drupal for archival collections. So it helps archivists implement archival standards, but make it easily accessible, collections browsable, usable to researchers online through a website. And both of those products are, at this point now, the most widely deployed applications in that particular sector. It's the fact that they're open source and free, of course, has been a big factor, but I think they're considered market leaders there as well. There's not a lot of money to be made in archives, to be frank. It's really a public good. The fact that when you need that one document, you really need it, but you didn't know that you didn't need the other 2 million, right? But you better keep that one. So like there's a cost. There's a cost to keeping information online and available, accessible. That's kind of a hidden cost. People just assume that's being taken care of. But so archives don't necessarily have big budgets, but they still have a big responsibility and a huge responsibility to society as a whole. And that's one reason that free and open source software for that community is so important, so that we can pool our collective knowledge, our infrastructure investments, and keep our digital collections online together by working together. So that's kind of my background. I very much believe in that way of working in an open source kind of like way. Radically open projects is how I prefer to work. So yeah, that's my background. I founded a company in Vancouver. My company, Vancouver Artifactual Systems, sponsors those two projects. And one of my staff turned me on to Bitcoin very early on. And again, it very much fit the ethos that we all kind of shared for free open source technology, decentralization, cryptography, privacy, security, those all things archivists are much concerned with. So I was very much interested early on. Early Bitcoin investor, then was very excited when smart contracts came around with Ethereum, and I've dabbled in various little projects all along, to the point where one of my side projects kind of took off, which was OrcFax, which got Project Catalyst funding, which then also led me to like applying for funding and building a team for Landano, which we also got. So now here I am as of January 1st. I switched over from artifactual systems, left that company in good hands. I'm still involved as an advisor, but I now work full-time on these Web3 projects.
Interesting, interesting. So the work that you, your kind of background, there is this, that sort of work, there's this kind of focus on verification and being able to verify information. And that's kind of very much suited to blockchain technology. Was there like a moment in your history where you're like, there was like this light bulb moment where you're like, okay, what I'm currently doing, this blockchain technology, which is also kind of open source stuff, could be a good candidate for that? Was there like a moment where, like a light bulb moment, or was it more like a gradient?
I think the light bulb moment for me was listening to Andreas Antonopoulos. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he's a Bitcoin evangelist. And he was one of the very first time I heard somebody say there's more to the Bitcoin than cryptocurrency. There's something underneath it called the blockchain that we should be paying more attention to. Like before then I kind of like, okay, yeah, that's all magic and this, how does it work? But then, you know, he made the point that there's a fundamental technology underlying this whole thing called Bitcoin. That's the big story. And that's what really, you know, distributed consensus and the ability to certify authenticity, like, or to prove authenticity, like to prove integrity, file integrity, file hasn't changed. Those are all features that we have been looking for in the digital preservation, digital archiving field. You know, we don't, your local public archives will not issue you a certificate of authenticity like a notary might certify a document. But there's still this implied, it's implied that if a document is at a public archives, that the archivists are doing their best to ensure that those documents remain authentic. And when they hand them over to you, you can trust them when you're doing your historical research or when you're doing whatever, you're interacting with the government or whatever else. But there was always, I knew as somebody working in the field that it was implied that there would be a certification of authenticity, but it wasn't really there. So that's when my light went off. I'm like, this blockchain thing can help us prove and certify authenticity and add to the integrity of, even more so, to the existing digital archive system. So that's when I became interested in it. And then what I realized quite quickly was that people were jumping right to the end to say, oh, blockchain gives you record keeping. Now you can put land records on the blockchain. Now you can put this on the blockchain. And all these promises were being made about what blockchain record keeping could do, which I thought like actually were too, they promised more than they could deliver. And so I think fundamentally the fact that we have the ability now to have distributed consensus in a permissionless peer-to-peer network with immutable append-only logs, like that fundamental technology is, like I said, is very powerful. It gives us these things like fixity checking, like being able to say this document exists at this point in time, and you can trust it because we've got this permissionless system with X number of nodes and peers that have validated this information. But of course, we also know that we're not going to put a whole document on the blockchain. There's simply not enough storage per block to put a PDF or what have you on the blockchain. So what we end up doing is we're creating hashes of the documents, and then we put the hashes on the blockchain, and that we can fit in transactions. And then people started, well, doing that is expensive. So let's batch a bunch of documents, then create a hash for that and put that hash in the blockchain. So the people were using the technology, but then the actual ability to verify the authenticity, to come back and say, I've got this document and it's gone through all these steps before this hash ended up in the blockchain. Nobody's ever yet created, in my opinion, a good usable solution that walks you back through those steps and proves the authenticity. And then secondly, there's a huge issue with accuracy. So you can put anything you want on the blockchain and create a hash for it. That doesn't prima facie make it authentic. So I can put like false data and create a hash for it to put in the blockchain and go, this is authentic. Yes, it is. It's authentic false data. So it's not accurate, right? So what's authentic about it is that I can prove that you, a bad actor, put it on the blockchain at this point in time. That's authentic information, but the actual contents, the data, is inaccurate. So we will also need accurate data, and we need authentic data. And the only way to do that is to have, the way we've always done it, is to have good business processes that capture records at the right time and bring them into a comprehensive record keeping system. And then we add those integrity checks. And we have to have good systems to prove the integrity checks. But then something else that's missing is called the archival bond. And that's really the most powerful thing that proves authenticity in archival collections. It's that document's relation to the previous document in the business process, to the subsequent document in the business process, to the business process itself, to the next iteration of the business process. All of those things can be uniquely identified. They can be hashed. So when you pull one thing out, even though you might be able to prove that, yes, in fact, this document was created at this point in time, but is it in fact that invoice that you're claiming it to be? Is it in fact this contract you're claiming it to be? Well, that process to create the invoice or contract would have had several business process steps beforehand. It would have produced other records in other registries and other systems, and you go and check against those, and then you can prove very easily what, right. And that's simply called archival bond. And there is no record-keeping system that explicitly shows your archival bond in the blockchain space right now. So again, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that I, as a digital archivist, have already observed about, what are, I was sitting on the sidelines watching this stuff and slowly interested, and I've gotten to the point now, I'm like, okay, it's time to like really, Web3, cryptocurrencies, despite the current crypto winter, I think they have a long-term future. And I think there's some expertise I can add to the mix that I think is important that I would like to get in there. So that's why I made the leap, and that's why I'm very excited to be working on something like Landano.
Okay, so that's a good segue. So what is Landano?
Right, so Landano, I think you gave it a quick little elevator pitch, is that we think of it as a decentralized land management application. So we want to give our end users, any stakeholder in any claim on a particular parcel of land, whether you are the owner or the user, and so forth, or the potential user, the ability to prove, the ability to store, recall, and present to other users documents that represent claims to land. And as well, so you can see I'm being very careful about my language there. We're not trying to become a land registry. Like, we are not the land registry, we're not the government. What we're finding is that there are a large number, okay, maybe I should back up. I want to jump into what problem we're solving, but I'm still trying to describe what we actually do. So we're a smartphone app. We have a smartphone app to bring up land records, that if you, to prove that you own land, to prove that you have the right to use land. And we are including a map interface that we're calling the Open Cadastral Map, where all the geospatial data that is public and related to a particular parcel of land is being made available to the public as well. There's a huge information discovery gap between people that want to use land records and actually getting at the land records. So we don't think we have to become the land registry office to provide a huge service in improving access to land documents and making it cheaper and easier to do things related to the land claim record keeping. And which is all not because the main purpose and our driving goal is the fact that it's quite well known that there's a issue in the global south and within marginalized communities. There's an estimate that there's up to 1 billion people that actually have a legal claim on land, but have no documentation to prove it. And then without that documentation, it becomes very difficult to do things like get a mortgage or get a business loan, or even if you don't have the documentation or the security that you have, you're able to easily prove your right to the land, you're not going to make an investment. Let's say you're farming the land, you're not going to put in long-term crops or crops that cost a lot. You want quick return crops. You don't want to invest, you're worried about making multi-year investments in your farmland, for example. So those are all very practical problems that stand in the way of those 1 billion marginalized people, that if they were to have proper trustworthy land record documentation, they could ideally take the next step, and it would solve a lot of conflicts locally, but then allows them to take the next step to then apply for loans against that claim to land, whether that be a mortgage. And then ideally, we want to make this as much of a DeFi bridge as possible as well, to say then, fine, now that we've got this, you don't have to go to a predatory mortgage provider that's asking you for 30%. You can go to our friends over at Empower, and by the way, we got a nice nice integration for you to take the next step once you get your land records on chain. So that's the idea, is to basically open the world of DeFi to people that have legitimate rights on land, but there's just so many just institutional, societal, economic barriers in the way, that we think there's a lot of very, again, low-hanging fruit first steps that we can take to blast through some of those and get that ball rolling. And that's really the purpose of Landano.
Okay, so I think you probably touched on maybe some of them, but could you outline some of the specific or the main problems that you're trying to solve with Landano? Yeah,
so again, first of all, there's very fundamentally, there's people that have legal right to land that don't have a document to prove it. So then there's a lot of that doesn't give them psychological security or even physical security. What's happening is there's actually a lot of double spending happening. So properties, land parcels being bought and sold behind the legitimate owner's back without any knowledge of all. They're called that blindsiding. And so again, due to the lack of a central registry or lack of a place where you can, again, confirm that there is no double spending happening. So that's one really crucial problem. And ideally, if we can find a way to create an immutable log and register all these land parcels in an open cadastral map, we can reduce the conflict and simply make life easier for the people that own the land. Again, secondly, the purpose is to then allow for DeFi opportunities, lending, borrowing, and other things once that land is available. Like I said, the problem is actually really more fundamental in a lot of ways too. Like a lot of what we're finding in early pilots is that, and so we're doing a pilot in Ghana, we're starting one in Mozambique. In a lot of African nations, there is recognition in the constitution and land laws for traditional practices for recognizing rights to land. But there is a gap between the communal leaders being able to then take that right and responsibility and use a more modern IT system to just manage it, right? Just to manage their records. So it's all done verbally. And that also leaves the door open for some bad apples, some bad leaders to make side deals without it being properly documented. But so there's a huge gap just in going from the traditional world to getting it registered, getting it online and digitized, getting the land claims registered online, and then going a few steps further before you even get to the land registry office. That first step is missing. And so we have a partner in Mozambique called Terra Firma that's been doing some amazing work around their process in constitutional land claim rights, allowing essentially traditional village leaders to create land associations for their communal land, and then follow the constitutional practice of individuals declaring their right to the land and being issued a document for that. Terra Firma has gone as far as producing laminated documents for that. We're going to go one step further now and mint those as Cardano-based NFTs. And we're seeing the same problem in Ghana. So we went into Ghana thinking we would tackle the urban land title issues, where there's a lot of conflict in Ghana. So over 50% of the court cases in Ghana currently are tied up in land conflict claims. So it's really a place that needs some help with this. So that's why we're hoping that, again, that's a good place for us to choose to have some impact. So we started off thinking we'd do something for these many urban land conflicts. But as it turns out, again, there was similar to Mozambique, there's these traditional land claim practices. Over 80% of the land in Ghana is managed and responsible for traditional community leaders. So that's called stool land or skin land in Ghana. Whether that's through a village chief or I forget the terminology, but anyway, so there's a variety of community leaders, but they simply don't have the tools to they rely on their own advisors. And then there is typically, of course, people have their best interest of community in mind, but they don't always. And by not having it well documented and regulated, it makes it easy to take advantage of those situations. So it's an anti-corruption play as well. And then lastly, it just costs a lot of money, to do anything with land registration. So we think we can solve that problem as well. So in Mozambique, for example, if somebody wants to go the next step and take the community land claims or claim land there, you have to travel several days to provincial city where they have the office. You might wait several days to actually meet with somebody there. And then the person behind the counter might not speak your local tongue. So you actually have a translation problem. And then the document may or may not be there. So the people just don't bother. And so, which means we just keep spinning up the same problems, just keep repeating over and over again. So we feel like this, land title registration is kind of this first notch in the wheel that hopefully can help mobilize economic social mobility.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier that Landano is not going to be like a land registry. They're not going to be involved with that part specifically. So I imagine you'd need to be working with a local land registry kind of officials.
Correct. Yeah.
Can you maybe step through how that process would look like? I guess you just were touching on some of the difficulties with respect to communication with people with speaking different languages, but how would that that relationship, that's like, there's no alternative, is there? It's not like you could bypass that. You have to work, you have to kind of
that's right.
merge the systems. They have to be interoperable at some point for this to work.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, and this is where I think some other land registry projects in the past have failed. They just worked in this kind of fantasy vacuum, and they don't recognize that there's real world people with real world roles that we will probably never replace or automate. Like you simply can't. So yeah, so the Land Commission Office and its mandated responsibilities and rights, and we can't replace that with a private entity unless at some point a government blesses it and lets you do that. But what we're trying to do is minimize the number of points where we're dependent on a authorized person to do something. So in order to do, there's some surveys have to be certified. In some cases, a notary has to sign something. In some cases, a lawyer has to sign something. So we've been working on these process maps. And the thing is that Ghana is a diverse country and has many provinces, and they're working on decentralizing the land, and it has all these various land commissions. So one process in one place is not necessarily the same in another place. So it's so we're very much trying to apply an agile software methodology, collecting user stories and having those drive our requirements, which actually reflects this kind of change to this rural context as well. But at the end of the day, there will always be a touch point where, like at this point now, we filed a document with, it's called the Land Commission in Ghana. We filed a document with the Land Commission. So the Land Commission is working hard at like providing like digital service desks, like trying to digitize as much of their work as possible as well. They of course want to move to the point where they can make it easier for their end users to, so ideally we can start interfacing with some of the new digital interface that they have, and then we can bulk submit documents. That's what we're hoping to do right now. But even again, if we have a professional, we're working with a land registry office in Kumasi, Ghana right now, the second largest city in Ghana. And we have a representative there that is building a relationship with the people there, explaining what we're doing, what we're trying to do, making sure we're not coming in and surprising anybody. And just that relationship alone means we now already have a person within our land, and this is what we envision, is that we'll have representatives, like whether that's a notary or lawyer that officially becomes part of the network, and then they will become the person that, okay, now is the step when we file a document, great, you go file this document, but go file 50 instead of one. And then like can we start reducing these costs, like and bringing these costs down, and we don't have it, we need to, part of our pilot work has to be, it costs X amount to do this, so then we know whether we need, how we make this sustainable, like how do we, so for example, the initial work to like survey a village and get that village boundary map is kind of one of those initial Genesis events that costs money. So like where does that money come from? And it's there's lots of options for that. Like again, it can be community sponsored. NGOs have been throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at land administration for years, and they're not getting anywhere. So there's lots of money to be available from grants from UN, World Bank, and those kind of places. So anyway, it's an interesting discussion around where does that money come from. But then once we figure out how much something costs, so then how can we figure out the minimal amount of transaction costs to do things on Landano, so that we drive the cost down for everybody, but we still keep the system sustainable so that it can maintain itself over time. But yeah, so we'll always need those land commissions. That we'll always need a lawyer. We'll always need a surveyor maybe, and those people cost money. So how much and how can we reduce those costs? Like that's all part of our analysis right now.
But also imagine the local land commission officers. It would be kind of like a mutually beneficial thing. Like their whole processes could improve through collaborating with something like Landano. So it's not like there would be a lot of, well, maybe like it seems like there wouldn't be a lot of friction to kind of adopt your sort of services. Like it would be something that would benefit everyone involved, it would seem. Yeah, we would like to think so. Like we came in the door with a complete boundary survey for a village that they didn't have before. It was all geospatial survey data using professional survey equipment, surveyors. So now they have missing data, like they have poor, missing, incomplete data, and we're going out in the field and we're going to either be creating that data where it doesn't exist, or we're going to verify their data. So they already see us as like a big help that way, just as purely as a data quality service in some ways. So yeah, which is nice to see. We weren't quite sure how that was going to work out.
but already we're kind of seen as like as a kind of like a partner that is able to contribute.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about some pilot projects. Could you maybe expand on a couple of the pilot projects that you are currently working on or plan to work on in the near future?
Yeah, so right at the current moment, we are doing a pilot project right in Ghana in the Kumasi region. We'll publish some blog posts over the next few weeks with more details. So we don't want to provide, we have to figure out what we can or can't share as far as private data at this moment, as far as making it public in a blog post. But yeah, we are working with a traditional village that has no survey data. That had the chief had no land title registrations for any of the parcels of land within his village that he was responsible for. So we started there, and we worked with them to do a boundary survey of their village, so that we can go back to the cadastral, to the land commission, and say, here's the village and here's all the land that the chief's responsible for. What do you have any registrations for any of the land within this village? And then so the chief is responsible for, like, managing land and issuing land use within the village, but also, of course, conflicts with neighboring villages if the boundary here isn't here, there. And that's where it's super interesting too, because of course this has been managed pretty good over like centuries, right? And so, but what we're in this interesting space now of like trying to respect those traditional rules and laws, but also give them a leg up into the modern world but not come in and say, oh, let's sprinkle some blockchain over this and we're going to fix all your problems for you. It's trying to respect how they see the world and the tools and how they want to use our tools and how they can best use our tools. So when we did the survey, for example, like there's a stream of land that separates the village from the next one, and then suddenly like there's a cliff that drops off, but you can see like a line where the water drew the line, and everybody knows that's the line. Like that side is our village, that side is your village. And on the opposite side, on the east side of the village, they had a special type of shrub that grows well in the jungle, but only grows about like 4 or 5 feet high. And so it's very distinguishable from the native shrubbery. So at some point, decades ago, the two villages came along and planted these trees to mark the village boundary. So that's in the ground, that's there. And so we're coming along, marking that up and recognizing and trying to figure out a way to respect those practices as well.
That's so interesting that was kind of how they would separate the pieces of land.
Yeah, well, and I think to this day, if there's a dispute happening on the ground right now, people would probably point to those shrubs or the line before they would pull up a smartphone and argue about a Landano record. So we still have to get to that point. But again, that's what we're trying to figure out how to respect both, right? So the other thing we recognize is that the majority of users we're targeting right now are rural, very poor. The majority are illiterate. Their villages have not reliable access to electricity or internet. So for us to come waltzing in with like heavy duty, GPS gear and like, bring up your smartphone and so there's all these very basic steps we have to think through, like how can we create completely off technology that works completely offline, technology that's cheap enough to leave in the hands of villagers and users, to make it easy to subsidize those like on the ground technology costs. Those are all interesting parts of things that we might take for granted if you're doing this pilot somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you would like to take a step back to the Cardano level. Is there what are the reasons for building Landano on Cardano?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I first learned about Cardano when Charles Hoskinson did a address at the Ethereum Classic conference here in Vancouver. So again, being an Ethereum kind of enthusiast for a long time. And then the DAO hack happened and there was a fork. I don't know if you remember that. This is a big, this is all blockchain crypto history. But there was like kind of like the true believers that said, well, no, we shouldn't have done a fork. We should have just kept with the original chain that was the Ethereum Classic. Charles and I think IOHK had a team working on that for a long time, and that's why they invited him to speak. Anyway, so I was like, wow, who is this guy? Like, he really knows what he's talking about. I like what he's saying. He kept mentioning Cardano, so I went and checked it out and did a deep dive for a couple of days and like was really sold on it. Like, I'd actually stopped doing I'd stopped doing my any Web3 or blockchain development for a while there. I got really disillusioned by all the greed and hype, and kind of like felt like it's lost its way in a way. And then I started, listening to Charles talking about banking the unbanked, and then like the Africa focus, and it's very heavily like attracting people that want to make a social impact. Like, it's a blockchain, whether technology is right for it or not, the community is one of people that are motivated to do social change. And so that change makers, and that pulled me in as well. And then, but also from a technical architect point of view, I really do like appreciate what the thinking that went into the extended UTXO model. It doesn't mean it's more challenging to implement right now in some ways, but like fundamentally, I think it's a really sound design. I also very much, just as an academic, somebody coming from very much an academic way of working, appreciate like the peer review formal methods approach that I saw. So a lot of the technologies, Web3 technologies that would come across my screen, it was felt like it was a bunch of like white papers, written on a college binge night, as opposed to one that was fairly well thought out and again, using peer review methodology. So anyway, the whole methodology and approach of the community appealed to me. And then best of all, there was this thing called Project Catalyst that said, hey, if you got a good idea, you don't have to appeal to our grant committee. We've got this open, decentralized, community-run treasury that if you have a good idea, you might get funded. So I had the one thing before Landano, but still very much related to my record keeping archives side of things. I've been very interested in the so-called Oracle problem. Like how do you take real world events and data and put them on the blockchain and prove that they're authentic and accurate? So again, that's tailor-made for my archives expertise and background. So I pitched a project that's called OrcFacts that's working on creating a Cardano-based Oracle. And what I propose to do is make that Oracle more trustworthy by having proper archival record keeping audit trails so that you can study where the data came from off-chain. And also after the fact, you can go back and have historical records for what data was published, where it came from, how consensus was arrived on it. So there's just not good audit trails, in my opinion, with most Oracle solutions currently.
Interesting.
And so that has to get bundled into a proper archival package and put somewhere in secure, trustworthy storage that anybody can access in a decentralized way. So that's, that became OrcFacts, and then it got funded. And then just by chance, I said, okay, let's have another look at the next round of funding, what's coming out. I saw one called Nation Building dApps, and then was one of the challenge was Nation Building dApps. And the way they set that challenge up was essentially to quote Hernando de Soto, who wrote a book in the early 2000s called The Mystery of Capitalism, The Mystery of Capital, Why Does Capitalism Work in the West and Fail Everywhere Else? And his thesis was essentially that people in the so-called, in the so-called developing world did not have land title records, and that was stopping them from taking that, the thesis I started talking about earlier, that's stopping them. So that was the central thesis of his book. It was quite popular in the 2000s. I did a lot of work. I was spending a lot of time in Washington, D.C. doing contracting work for like the World Bank and IMF, and they flew him out and had a big do, and all the archives people were so excited because that meant records were now important because people were going to use records to prove that they owned land, and then it was going to help everybody. And then it just kind of fizzled out. And it turns out there's lots of controversy around his own motivations, and he's a bit of a neoliberalist and how he's done his research. But at the end of the day, the argument doesn't go away. Anyway, that caught my eye because that was an idea that I'd thought about quite a bit as a way that archivists can make a real impact, that records can make a real impact. And so when I saw it quoted and saw some people starting to talk about that, I was like, oh, I can't not get involved. I gotta speak up as an archivist and go, well, we should do this and this. And next thing I know, I met my co-founder, Doris van der Kroft, who's a Rotterdam-based software developer, and we started building a team around this. And we got our funding, and we're now up and running. So that's exciting. That's Cardano. That's why we chose Cardano.
Yeah, and shout out to Project Catalyst. Whenever this podcast mentions Project Catalyst, I always like to give a shout out because it's just such a awesome thing that no one outside of Cardano really knows about, or if they do, they don't acknowledge. But it's such a powerful thing that is part of the Cardano ecosystem, and we benefited as well in power. So yeah, shout out to Project Catalyst.
Yeah, 100%. I wouldn't be sitting here talking today if it wasn't for that. The opportunities that Landano and OrcFacts have in front of us now are completely dependent on the opportunity we got through Project Catalyst. So yeah, it's got its own growing pains and drama now and then, but I believe in it. I'm a firm believer in the Catalyst vision and where it's going and what the great things that it's allowing people to do.
Yeah, definitely. Another thing with Cardano is the term RealFi. It's kind of coined as a Cardano coin term. But often people have different, they define it maybe differently. So some think of RealFi as DeFi with real world impact. Some people define it as DeFi, which is linked to real world assets. Maybe it's a combination of both. how do you think of RealFi? How would you kind of maybe define RealFi, or how would you think about RealFi?
Yeah, I think it very simplistically when I first heard the term, I was, like I said, I was already thinking about this oracle problem. Like there's the real world, there's something that happens in the real world, there's time, space, and an event somewhere in the 4-dimensional grid, there's an event, and that's what oracles report on. And that's the real world. And then how do I bring it into the DeFi, into the crypto world? And so in my mind already, there was this thing about, what's happening over here in meat space, where you and I are actually living right now, versus cyberspace of ones and zeros. And so to me, it was always like something where blockchain technology had an actual real world impact on a person or an entity or an event in the real world. And so it's not a bunch of ones and zeros, doing a swap or flash loan, and it's never touched the real world. And so if I'm able to lend you money to build a house, that house is a real thing. If I'm able to get you a record that represents real land, that's a real thing. If I'm able to source locally grown cotton and build and manufacture clothing with it, and that clothing and that cotton are real things, and representing those on chain is what RealFi does. That to me is RealFi. To me, it's also, I guess in a way, it's also a little bit of like an ethos, right? Like it is a way of like saying, can we just please stop all this like JPEG NFT business for a while and get on with like, helping the world? Wasn't that what we were signed up for, right? And to me, it's like, I feel like the people that are kind of gathering under the RealFi banner kind of fit, whether that's, a 100% technically accurate way of thinking about it, it's also kind of a movement in a way, isn't it? Like people that say, wasn't it supposed to be about social change? Like, let's get on with that. And that to me is what RealFi feels like too.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. There's this value flow between meat space and cyberspace. I like how you, the word meat space, it's a good way to think of it. And I like the idea of it as a movement as well, because it's ultimately, I think blockchain, while I think of blockchain as a tool to kind of improve upon the world that we kind of live in at the moment, the real world, the tangible world. There's so many problems to solve, and blockchain is just a really amazing tool that has so much potential to address some of these problems. If you want to completely live in the metaverse and your life is just cyberspace, then it probably has that functionality as well, and that's cool. But the real world stuff is where I'm personally really excited about. We're nearing the end of the podcast. There's a couple more questions. Is there anything that you wanted to touch on that we haven't touched on so far?
No, I think this
covered most things.
Some very detailed questions. I just rant on until you tell me to stop. So I just want to say I really love Empower, by the way. I just want to say like what a great inspiration Empower has been to me personally and to the Landano project. Like you guys are really the first one to plant that RealFi flag in my opinion. And just seeing how you guys carried yourself and marketed yourself like really gave me a boost of confidence that projects like ours can follow that trail as well. So I just want to say good on you guys. Like I think you're really kind of a few steps ahead of a lot of us, and you guys are very inspiring. So I love the project too. Empower project.
Appreciate it, bro. Appreciate it.
And then of course, I mean, like you said earlier, like this is a very natural connection, right? Like that chain, we would like to then, we're actively talking to projects like Empower to figure out how, once we get land title registration documents on our platform, how do we easily integrate with the next step, and how do we open DeFi to our users? Yeah,
and I think that's one part of this podcast as well, is really getting to know as many RealFi projects and Cardano, not only as a learning tool, but also just an exposure tool. Like we just learning about what projects exist and where we can collaborate. And, if we have you on our podcast, maybe someone else who is working in a similar area can kind of learn about you for the first time. And then I think in this space where we're just growing, like this is a fairly new movement, exposure to these different ideas and collaborating where it makes sense is going to be quite powerful, especially during the time in crypto at the moment where it seems maybe there's not a lot of hype. This is the time to be building and collaborating. So that really gets me excited, the building, the collaborating and the building side of things at the moment.
I think the crypto winter, of course, it's unfortunate people lose real money. Never invest more than you can afford to lose. But in some ways, for people like you, like for projects like Empower and Landano, it maybe helps a little bit to get a little bit of heat out of the, out of the bubble, a little air out of the bubble. And I agree 100%. Like I think the space has been distracted, to be honest with you. And I would like, after this bear market, I think RealFi could be the engine that drives crypto forward after this. Like if it's no longer it's real world stuff that people need. If we just start implementing these things and they actually work, we're going to introduce blockchain through the back door before people realize that we're running half the world's system. So that's to me like how this is going to work. And having and a lot of the market hype is actually a risk. Like it's actually a danger for us being able to have the resources and time to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. So I don't even look, yes, I'm an investor in crypto as well, but I have been for a long time. So I know not to look at my balance when I don't need to.
Yeah, it's probably good for your mental health if you kind of maybe check it a bit less. But yeah, I agree. I think RealFi is hopefully going to be, we have these trends in crypto, we have metaverse, we have NFTs. Hopefully RealFi is around the corner, because I think that's when you get some real change happening, hopefully. Okay, so how can people connect with Landano, get involved with your community, support your work? How do they go about doing that?
Yeah, well, the best way is just to follow us online. So we've got our website at landano.io, and that has like a newsletter sign up. So anytime we put a blog post out, which we're going to try to do more regularly going forward, you'll get a copy in your inbox. And then we're building our community around Twitter right now. And so, yeah, we're also at twitter.com/Landano dApp. And that's the best way just to interact with us for the time being. We love getting feedback from the community, but yeah, like I said, pretty much throughout this podcast, we're very much focused on building at the moment. So, the stuff we talk about is those pilots in the building. And then, we'll start working on something resembling a white paper near the end of the summer. And then we'll start thinking about more practical things like, tokenomics, those kinds of things. People do ask about that. Yes, there will be a token. There will be a utility token to fund transactions, perhaps act as a stable coin. Whether that's our own token or somebody else's, that's none of that stuff we decided yet. Our first focus is like figuring out what we need to build, make it work, and then how to keep it sustainable is the next question. Once we get an idea of costs and all the options that are out there. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll add those links in the description. And for the final question, which is a forward kind of looking question, what excites you the most about the future of RealFi?
I think it's like, I think if we can keep this industry going long enough to actually start, implementing the kind of solutions that your project and our project is working on. Like I said, the way I see this transition happening is like, I believe in blockchain and Web3 because I believe that centralized systems, centralized governance, centralized finance are at the root of almost all our problems, whether climate change, war, economic inequality, you have it. Like, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we have centralized systems in all sectors of society that put certain people at the top and allow them to make selfish decisions. And so I think, starting with finance, if we were to be able to decentralize that with infrastructure systems that just becomes part of daily life that people don't think twice about, and then move towards things like governance, like how we make rules for how to regulate our world, and on and on and on. I think blockchain fundamentally, like I said earlier, like has a fundamental technology that other technologies, like it is something like, I believe there's going to be a technological shift as fundamental as when we introduced TCP for the internet or GSM for mobile phones. Like blockchain technology is just one of those things that's not going to go away. And it's going to, I think it's, the old phrase, software will eat the world. I think blockchain technology will slowly eat the world, but it should not be about running ads for Bored Apes online during the Super Bowl. It should just be like slow but steady, kind of like replacement of backend infrastructure, where people the technology used today just gets replaced by better decentralized systems, right? And I see something like the backlash against centralized platforms like Twitter and Facebook People wanting data sovereignty and data ownership, that could easily be kind of like the starting point for like a mass kind of shift, where if Web3 can offer that, and oh, by the way, it's enabled by like blockchain microtransactions in the background, which you don't have to think about, right? We have to get the usability right. So I think that's the future. And that's the exciting thing to me for RealFi, about RealFi, is that hopefully then we can organize ourselves better. I think the majority of people are reasonable. Like, I do believe in this, wisdom of the crowd versus the madness of the mob. I think if we can put the right tools and systems in the place of the general population, I think together the world can make better decisions for ourselves than what our current leadership is doing. So, and I think that's my hope. That's the dream. That's why I work on RealFi, because I think, again, I play my small part as an archivist. I think it's a small, but I think crucial part. And I'm just trying to help push those solutions forward, which, at the end of the day, these are tough times, right? So, the fact that I can wake up in the morning and feel like I'm making a positive change is actually really, really powerful. Like, it's like a good way just to stay sane in this crazy world. So I would encourage other people on the fence, like, come join us in the Web3
Join
world.
us. Yeah.
We need your help.